Jake Murphy had seen some terrible Tuesdays in his 32 years of existence, but this one was shaping up to be a real champion. The kind of Tuesday that makes you question your life choices, your career path, and whether the universe has a personal vendetta against you specifically. He wiped down the grimy bar counter of the Rusty Nebula for the fourth time that hour, mostly because standing still made him think about his problems, and thinking about his problems made him want to drink his own inventory. Which, considering the bar served something called plutonian brain melter, would probably solve his problems permanently. The Rusty Nebula sat in the armpit of Space Station Omega-7, catering to the kind of clientele that other establishments politely asked to leave. Bounty hunters nursing grudges, smugglers counting credits, and criminals of every species in the galaxy gathered here to drink overpriced alcohol and pretend they weren't one bad decision away from becoming space debris. Jake had been mixing drinks for alien lowlifes for 3 years now, ever since his brilliant plan to see the galaxy had crashed and burned faster than a cargo ship with faulty engines. Turns out, interstellar travel required money, and money required skills, and his philosophy degree from Earth apparently didn't translate well to useful qualifications in galactic society. His boss, a perpetually angry Centauri named Grix, had already threatened to dock his pay twice this week, first for excessive politeness to customers, which apparently made them uncomfortable, and then for insufficient enthusiasm during the dinner rush, which consisted of serving fermented fungus to a table of Martian pirates. The regulars were their usual charming selves. Vortex, a 6-armed card sharp from the Andromeda sector, had been nursing the same drink for 2 hours while glaring at anyone who looked at his cards. The Regellian twins, Kix and Nox, were engaged in their daily argument about whose turn it was to pay their tab from last month. And Commander Thorne, a retired military officer with more cybernetic parts than original biology, sat in his usual corner booth muttering about kids these days. And back in my war, Jake had learned to tune out most of the background noise. When your customer base included beings who communicated through bioluminescent tentacle displays and others who considered public executions a form of entertainment, you developed selective hearing pretty quickly. He was in the middle of mixing something called a quantum collapse for a trader who insisted it had to be exactly 17% more radioactive than last time when the front door exploded inward. Not opened, not pushed, exploded into roughly 14 pieces that scattered across the floor like expensive confetti. The bar went dead silent, which in the Rusty Nebula was roughly equivalent to a miracle. Even Vortex stopped cheating at cards. Through the smoking doorframe stepped something that looked like a 7-foot-tall lizard had been crossed with a bodybuilder, painted dark green, and given serious anger management issues. Warlord Krex'thul the Destroyer, according to the wanted posters that were plastered across every bounty board in 3 sectors. The kind of being who conquered star systems as a hobby and considered genocide a Tuesday afternoon activity. Jake sighed and reached for the industrial-strength cleaning supplies. At this rate, Grix was definitely going to dock his pay for property damage. Krex'thul surveyed the bar with the kind of casual menace that suggested he was deciding whether to kill everyone immediately or wait until after he'd ordered a drink. His scaled hide was scarred from countless battles, his eyes glowed an unsettling shade of amber, and his claws looked sharp enough to open cans or jugulars with equal efficiency. Pathetic establishment, Krex'thul announced in a voice like grinding stone. I require the strongest poison you serve, something worthy of destroying weak minds and dissolving inferior digestive systems. Jake looked at the warlord, then at his paycheck that was already being threatened by his boss, then at the broken door he'd probably have to clean up. Tuesday was really hitting its stride now. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as either the bravest or stupidest thing they'd ever seen, depending on their perspective and how much they'd been drinking. Krex'thul had claimed the center table and launched into what could generously be called a monologue, but was more accurately described as a verbal war crime. He detailed his recent conquests with the enthusiasm of someone reading grocery lists, except the groceries were planets and the shopping was genocide. The Kepler system fell in mere hours, he announced, gesturing dramatically with his drink. Their pathetic defense fleet crumbled like dried leaves before my armada. The screams of their dying were music to my auditory receptors. The other patrons had made themselves scarce with remarkable speed. Vortex had folded his cards and vanished into the shadows. The Regellian twins had actually paid their tab and left, which Jake would have found impressive under different circumstances. Even Commander Thorne had decided his cybernetic parts needed maintenance elsewhere. Jake continued serving drinks because, frankly, what else was he going to do? Hide in the storage room with the cleaning supplies? Krex'thul was paying customer, even if his idea of small talk involved detailed descriptions of orbital bombardments. The Tau's SETI colony thought their plasma shields would protect them, Krex'thul continued, his voice rising with each sentence. I showed them the futility of resistance when I personally incinerated their capital city from orbit. The crater is still visible from space. Jake mixed another drink, something called Extinction Event that was basically pure alcohol with a radiation chaser. He'd served worse. The Warlord was hitting his stride now, standing on his chair to better project his voice to an audience that had fled 20 minutes ago. Their surrender came too late, naturally. I had already begun sterilizing the surface. Weakness disgusts me. Mercy is for the feeble-minded. Jake slid the drink across the bar and went back to cleaning glasses. In his experience, drunk customers eventually either passed out, started fights, or left. Sometimes all three, depending on the species and the alcohol tolerance. But Krex'thul wasn't following the usual pattern. Instead of winding down, he was winding up, getting louder and more obnoxious with each sip. He knocked over a chair while gesturing wildly about some battle strategy. He slammed his fist on the table hard enough to crack the surface while describing the artistic beauty of watching a moon explode. When he started throwing empty bottles at the wall, while explaining his philosophy on the necessity of fear and maintaining order, Jake reached his breaking point. It wasn't the property damage, though Grix would definitely blame him for that. It wasn't even the constant stream of violence and destruction being discussed like it was weather patterns. It was the simple, overwhelming exhaustion of dealing with one more obnoxious customer on one more terrible Tuesday. Jake set down the glass he was cleaning, walked around the bar, and looked directly at the 7-foot-tall genocidal warlord who had conquered half the known galaxy. "Hey," he said, his voice cutting through Krex'thul's monologue about the sweet sounds of planetary devastation. "Shut up and drink quietly, or get out." The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the ventilation system cycling. Krex'thul stopped mid-sentence, his glowing eyes focusing on the human bartender with laser intensity. For a moment, Jake wondered if this was how his obituary would read: death by warlord, cause, terminal honesty. But instead of the expected disintegration, something unexpected happened. Krex'thul's expression shifted from homicidal rage to something that might have been surprise, if warlords were capable of surprise. "You," Krex'thul said slowly, "just told me to be quiet." "Yeah," Jake replied, because at this point, backing down would probably get him killed anyway. "Other people are trying to drink in peace." Krex'thul looked around the empty bar, then back at Jake. A sound emerged from his throat that might have been laughter if you were feeling optimistic. 20 minutes later, when Krex'thul's personal army stormed through the broken door, expecting to find their leader's murderer, they instead found the galaxy's most feared warlord buying drinks for a human bartender and asking about his opinions on military strategy. Tuesday had officially jumped the shark into completely surreal territory. Jake was beginning to suspect that his life had taken a hard left turn into pure insanity somewhere around the third round of drinks that Krex'thul insisted on buying. The warlord's entire personal guard had crowded into the Rusty Nebula, transforming the seedy dive bar into something resembling a military command center. If military command centers served alcohol and had really questionable hygiene standards. "You possess qualities I require," Krex'thul announced, slamming his glass down with enough force to crack the table. "I offer you position as strategic advisor to my empire." Jake stared at him. "You want me to what now?" "Join my command structure. Provide counsel on matters of conquest and domination. Share your obvious wisdom in the art of management." The warlord's lieutenants exchanged glances that clearly said our boss has finally lost his mind completely. Jake couldn't blame them. He was having similar thoughts about his own sanity. Look, Jake said, refilling Krex'thul's glass because arguing with drunk customers was bad for business. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not really advisor material. I mix drinks and clean up after people. That's it. Nonsense. Krex'thul waved a clawed hand dismissively. You demonstrated leadership when you commanded me to cease my vocal expressions. You showed tactical thinking when you assessed the situation and chose direct confrontation over cowering. These are qualities I need. Jake glanced around at the assembled military officers. General Blorg, a massive creature that looked like someone had crossed a rhinoceros with an overeager puppy, was nodding enthusiastically at everything Krex'thul said. Admiral Z, a spindly being with too many eyes, kept glancing around suspiciously as if expecting assassins to emerge from the ventilation shafts. Dr. Rill, whose species Jake couldn't identify but who radiated the kind of manic energy that suggested questionable experiments in dark laboratories, was taking notes on a datapad while muttering under his breath. Your current advisors seem... Jake searched for a diplomatic word. Enthusiastic. They are terrified, Krex'thul said bluntly. They tell me what they believe I want to hear. When I ask for strategic options, Blorg suggests charging directly at the enemy while screaming. Z proposes elaborate conspiracy theories involving shadow governments and mind control. Quill recommends biological weapons that may or may not work and definitely violate several galactic treaties. Those sound like... Jake paused. Actually, those sound like terrible ideas. Precisely. Which is why I require someone who will provide honest counsel without fear of execution. Jake looked around the bar, taking in his current situation. His apartment was the size of a closet and smelled like recycled air filters. His boss threatened to fire him on a daily basis. His romantic life consisted of occasionally chatting with the station's automated customer service system because it was programmed to be polite. His career prospects involved either staying at the Rusty Nebula until he died of old age or liver failure, whichever came first. What exactly would this job involve? He asked, surprising himself. Krex'thul's eyes lit up with something that might have been hope. Attend strategy meetings. Review invasion plans. Provide perspective on diplomatic matters. Standard advisory duties. And the pay? 10,000 credits per month, plus full medical coverage, housing aboard my flagship, and a share of conquest spoils. Jake nearly choked on his own spit. 10,000 credits was more than he made in a year at the bar. And if I say no, then you return to your current existence. And I respect your decision, Krex'thul said. I am many things, but I do not force loyalty. It must be earned and freely given. Jake looked around the empty bar, at the broken door, at the stains on the floor that were probably older than he was. He thought about Grix threatening to dock his pay. He thought about spending another year serving drinks to criminals while slowly going insane from boredom and loneliness. I have conditions, he said finally. The military officers looked scandalized. You don't negotiate with warlords. You accept their gracious offers or you become space dust. But Krex'thul leaned forward with interest. State them. First, no murdering people just because they disagree with you. If you ask for my advice, you have to at least listen to it before deciding I'm wrong. Acceptable. Second, I get Sundays off. Completely off. No emergency conquest meetings. No urgent strategic sessions. Sundays are for sleeping late and complaining about things. Agreed. Like. Third, if this doesn't work out, you let me quit without turning me into a cautionary tale. Krex'thul extended a clawed hand. You have my word as a warrior. Jake shook it, noting that the warlord was careful not to crush his significantly smaller human fingers. All right then, I guess I'm your new strategic advisor. General Blorg let out a cheer that shattered what remained of the bar's glassware. Admiral Z muttered something about unexpected developments and possible mind control scenarios. Dr. Quill cackled and started making notes about fascinating human psychology. Jake looked around at his new colleagues and wondered if he'd just made the best decision of his life or the last decision of his life. Probably both, knowing his luck. Jake's first day as strategic advisor to a galactic warlord began with what Krex'thul proudly called a comprehensive briefing on current military operations, but what Jake would more accurately describe as organized insanity with color-coded charts. The command briefing room aboard Krex'thul's flagship, the Inevitable Doom, was impressive in the way that things designed to intimidate tended to be impressive. Massive displays showed star maps covered in red zones indicating conquered territories, and yellow zones marked as pending obliteration. The conference table was made from what appeared to be polished metal salvaged from destroyed warships, but because apparently even furniture needed to send a message about military superiority. "Behold," Krex'thul announced, gesturing grandly at a holographic display, "our current strategic priorities." Jake studied the projection, which showed invasion plans for 6 different star systems, all scheduled to begin simultaneously next week. It was like looking at someone's attempt to juggle chainsaws while riding a unicycle, blindfolded, during an earthquake. "So," Jake said carefully, "you're planning to attack 6 systems at the same time." "Efficiency," General Blorg declared enthusiastically. "Swift, decisive action across multiple fronts. The enemy won't know where to concentrate their defenses." "Neither will we," Jake pointed out. "How exactly are you planning to command 6 separate invasions happening light years apart?" Krex'thul frowned. "Superior tactical genius and unwavering determination. That's not actually a logistics plan. That's more like a motivational poster." Admiral Z leaned forward, his multiple eyes focusing on Jake with paranoid intensity. "Perhaps this human is an agent of the Galactic Council, sent to sabotage our operations through seemingly reasonable suggestions." Or, Jake said, "I'm pointing out that trying to do everything at once usually means doing nothing well. Which one of these targets is actually important?" Krex'thul consulted his notes. "The Vega system has valuable mining operations. The Centauri colonies have strategic positioning. The Rigel sector controls major trade routes. The Tau Eridani system has insulted my honor. The Wolf system has defensive capabilities that threaten our expansion. The Proxima system has resources we require." "Right," Jake said. "So they're all important for completely different reasons, which means they'll all require completely different strategies. You can't use the same plan for a mining operation that you'd use for a trade hub." Dr. Quill looked up from his datapad. "The human speaks of differentiated tactical approaches based on target-specific variables. Fascinating concept. Have we considered this before?" "We conquer," Krex'thul said firmly. "Our approach is consistent and effective." "Your approach is to show up with a lot of ships and start shooting until everything stops moving," Jake said. "Which works great until you run into someone who shoots back better than you do." The room fell silent. Criticizing Krex'thul's military strategy was generally considered career-limiting behavior, in the sense that careers tended to end abruptly and messily. But instead of ordering Jake's execution, Krex'thul stroked his scaled chin thoughtfully. "Elaborate." Jake pulled up the tactical display for the Tau Eridani system. "Look at this. You're planning a full frontal assault on their primary defense station. Maximum firepower, overwhelming force, crush all resistance. Standard procedure." Blorg nodded approvingly. "Except," Jake continued, "their defense station is protecting a civilian population of 12 million people. When you blow it up, where do you think all that debris is going to fall?" "On the planet below," Krex'thul said slowly. "Right. And then instead of conquering a productive system with useful infrastructure and grateful subjects, you've got a debris field and 12 million very angry ghosts haunting your new territory." Dr. Quill was scribbling notes furiously. "Collateral damage assessment protocols. Resource preservation strategies. Long-term occupation viability. These are revolutionary concepts." "These are basic customer service skills," Jake said. "If you want people to cooperate with you long-term, you don't start the relationship by accidentally dropping a space station on their heads." Over the following weeks, Jake found himself applying increasingly ridiculous amounts of common sense to galactic warfare. He introduced concepts like talking to people before shooting them, reading the entire intelligence report instead of just the summary. And maybe don't attack during their major religious holidays. The results were, frankly, embarrassing for everyone involved. The Vega system surrendered after Jake suggested they offer mining partnerships instead of strip mining operations. The Centauri colonies agreed to join the Empire voluntarily when Krex'thul promised to protect their trade routes instead of disrupting them. The Rigel Sector Treaty was signed during a 3-hour negotiation session that Jake moderated like he was settling a bar tab dispute. "I don't understand," Krex'thul said after their 4th consecutive diplomatic victory. "Why does everyone keep agreeing to our terms? Where are the glorious battles? The heroic last stands? The satisfying explosions?" "Turns out," Jake said, "most people prefer not getting blown up if there's an alternative." "Who knew?" "Ma'am." General Blorg looked confused. "But how do we demonstrate our superior military might if we don't use it?" "By having it available but not needing it," Jake explained. "It's like carrying a big stick. People respect the stick more when you don't hit them with it." Admiral Z was convinced this was all part of an elaborate conspiracy, but couldn't figure out who was conspiring or what they were trying to achieve, which frustrated him enormously. Dr. Quill had started referring to Jake's methods as applied human psychology for galactic domination and was working on a research paper about it. And Krex'thul was discovering that conquest through cooperation was not only more efficient than conquest through violence, but also significantly less expensive and much better for his public image. The galaxy, meanwhile, was trying to figure out what the hell had happened to their most reliable source of interstellar conflict. The Galactic Council had been watching Krex'thul's recent behavior with the kind of nervous attention usually reserved for unstable explosives or relatives visiting for extended periods. Warlords weren't supposed to negotiate. They were supposed to conquer, destroy, and generally make life difficult for civilized beings across the galaxy. When a notorious destroyer of worlds suddenly started signing trade agreements and attending diplomatic conferences, the Council got worried. Which is why they sent Ambassador Vex Rita to investigate. Jake had heard of Vex Rita, because everyone in the galaxy had heard of Vex Rita. She was a Voltarian, one of those species that looked deceptively harmless but could probably negotiate you out of your own soul if you weren't paying attention. She had ended 3 separate galactic wars through pure diplomatic skill, mediated the peace treaty that ended the Great Trade War of 2387, and once convinced an entire pirate fleet to become legitimate businessmen through what witnesses described as terrifyingly effective conversation. If the Galactic Council wanted to know what was happening with Krex'thul, they were sending their absolute best to find out. "She's requesting a formal diplomatic meeting," Admiral Z reported, his paranoia levels elevated to somewhere near imminent galactic conspiracy. "This is obviously a trap designed to assess our capabilities and identify weaknesses in our command structure." Or Jake suggested, "She wants to talk." "Talking is how Voltarians gather intelligence," Z insisted. "Every word is a probe for information. Every pause is a psychological assessment. Every question is designed to reveal strategic vulnerabilities." Krex'thul was pacing the command deck like a caged predator, which was probably accurate since he was basically a predator who'd been asked to attend a tea party. "I should refuse the meeting. Show strength through non-engagement." "That'll just convince them you're planning something worse," Jake said. "Besides, isn't this what we've been working toward? Proving that you can solve problems without blowing things up?" "But what if she's more skilled at negotiation than I am?" Krex'thul asked, revealing a vulnerability that Jake had suspected but never heard admitted out loud. "Then we're lucky I used to work in customer service," Jake said. "Same basic principles apply. Listen to what they actually want, figure out what you can give them that doesn't cost you anything important, and try not to insult anyone's mother unless they insult yours first." The meeting was held in neutral space, aboard a Council diplomatic vessel that was probably equipped with enough recording devices to archive every breath taken during the proceedings. Ambassador Vex Rita was everything Jake had expected, elegant, composed, and radiating the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing you were the smartest person in the room, and everyone else knew it too. "Warlord Krex'thul," she began, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone accustomed to being listened to carefully. Your recent activities have attracted considerable attention. I continue to expand my territory and influence, Krex'thul replied, falling back on his standard diplomatic responses. Through negotiation and trade agreements, Vex Rita observed. An interesting development for someone whose previous methodology favored orbital bombardment. Jake could see Krex'thul tensing, preparing to fall back into his old patterns of threats and posturing. This was the moment where everything could go sideways. People change, Jake interjected before Krex'thul could respond. Turns out there are more efficient ways to get what you want than blowing things up. Vex Rita's attention shifted to Jake with laser focus. And you are? Jake Murphy, strategic advisor. I help with the logistics of not destroying everything we're trying to conquer. Fascinating. Her tone suggested she found Jake about as fascinating as a particularly interesting bacterial culture. And how exactly does one advise a warlord on the logistics of restraint? Jake shrugged. Same way you talk anyone out of doing something stupid. You show them why it's stupid and offer them something better. What followed was 3 hours of the most intense conversation Jake had ever experienced. Vex Rita probed every aspect of their recent diplomatic successes, looking for hidden agendas, secret weapons, or evidence of mind control. She questioned their motives, their methods, and their long-term intentions with the precision of a surgeon and the persistence of a tax auditor. But gradually, something interesting happened. As Jake explained their approach to conflict resolution, as Krex'thul demonstrated his genuine commitment to diplomatic solutions, and as their crew showed how much more effective cooperation had been than conquest, Vex Rita's attitude began to shift. You're serious, she said finally. You've actually convinced a galactic warlord to choose negotiation over annihilation. I convinced him that getting what you want without fighting is more efficient than getting what you want by fighting, Jake corrected. The results speak for themselves. Vex Rita leaned back in her chair, studying them both with new interest. The council was prepared for threats, demands, or elaborate deceptions. They were not prepared for competent diplomacy. To be fair, Jake said, neither were we. The meeting ended with something Jake had never expected, a formal recognition of Krex'thul's empire as a legitimate political entity, eligible for trade agreements and diplomatic relations with council member states. As they returned to their ship, Krex'thul was unusually quiet. Having second thoughts? Jake asked. I was feared across the galaxy, Krex'thul said slowly. Now I am respected. Is that worse? Krex'thul considered this. No, he said finally, but it is very different. Jake nodded. Different isn't always bad. Besides, you can still blow things up if you really need to. You just don't need to anymore. This is true, Krex'thul agreed. And the supply costs are significantly lower. Jake laughed. See? You're getting the hang of this management thing. 6 months later, Jake Murphy found himself in the bizarre position of being the galaxy's most unlikely peace broker. A job title that didn't exist until he accidentally created it. His business cards, which he'd had printed as a joke, read strategic advisor and professional problem solver, with the subtitle specializing in conflict resolution and reasonable behavior. The inevitable doom had been retrofitted with conference rooms instead of additional weapons bays, which General Blorg still complained about on a regular basis. Admiral Z had redirected his paranoia toward monitoring potential trade disputes, which turned out to be surprisingly useful for early intervention. Dr. Quill had started researching applied diplomacy as a science, and was working on a paper about the psychological benefits of not destroying everything you disagreed with. And Krex'thul's empire had become known throughout the galaxy for its aggressive negotiation tactics and surprisingly fair trade agreements. His reputation had evolved from terrifying destroyer of worlds to terrifyingly effective businessman, which was probably an improvement. Jake still complained about his job, because complaining was fundamental to his nature and probably kept him sane. But now, instead of griping about terrible tips and drunk customers, he complained about bureaucratic inefficiency and triplicate filing systems, and the unreasonable amount of paperwork required for interstellar peace treaties. The Andromedans want to renegotiate Clause 15 of the Mining Rights Agreement, General Blorg reported during their weekly staff meeting. They're claiming the current terms are unreasonably favorable to human interests. Which human interests? Jake asked, reviewing the contract on his datapad. Yours. Apparently. They're specifically objecting to the provision requiring all dispute resolution meetings to include adequate coffee service and comfortable seating. Jake looked up from his notes. Those aren't human interests. Those are basic civilization requirements. You can't expect people to make reasonable decisions while sitting on uncomfortable chairs and drinking terrible coffee. The Andromedans don't drink coffee, Admiral Z pointed out. They absorb nutrients through their skin via specialized chemical baths. Then we'll provide adequate chemical bath facilities, Jake said. The principle remains the same. Comfortable negotiators make better deals. Krex'thul nodded approvingly. This wisdom has served us well. Our conference facilities are now considered the finest in 3 sectors. Speaking of which, Jake said, checking his schedule, we've got the Bellatrix situation coming up next week. 2 species arguing over who makes better coffee, and it's escalated to the point where they're threatening military action. Over coffee? Dr. Quill asked, looking up from his research notes. Over the principle of coffee superiority, Jake corrected. Which is actually worse, because principles are harder to compromise on than practical disputes. How do we resolve a conflict over subjective preferences? Krex'thul asked. Jake grinned. Same way I used to handle arguments between drunk customers at the bar. Set up a blind taste test, invite neutral judges, and let the results speak for themselves. Loser buys the first round of whatever peace celebration we end up having. And if they refuse to accept the results? Then we point out that if they're willing to go to war over coffee, they probably have bigger problems that need addressing first. As Jake reviewed the case files for the upcoming mediation, he realized something that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. He was good at this job. Not just competent, but actually good. He understood people, he could read situations, and he had a talent for finding solutions that everyone could live with. It was, he reflected, essentially the same skill set he'd used as a bartender. Listen to people complain, figure out what they actually wanted, and find a way to give it to them without anyone getting hurt. The scale was different, but the principles were identical. You know, he said to Krex'thul after the meeting, I just realized something. I'm still basically a bartender. I just have a much larger, more dysfunctional clientele now. Krex'thul considered this. Does this trouble you? Jake looked around the conference room, with its displays showing peaceful trade routes instead of conquest targets, and its comfortable chairs arranged for productive discussion instead of intimidation, and its well-stocked coffee station that had become legendary among galactic diplomats. Nah, he said finally. The pay's better, the hours are more reasonable, and nobody's threatened to dock my salary in weeks. Plus the customers are more interesting. Even when they threaten interstellar warfare over beverage preferences. Especially then, Jake laughed. At least they're passionate about something. You should have seen some of the regulars at the Rusty Nebula. Half of them were just drinking to forget they existed. Krex'thul nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps, he said, we should establish a retirement program for former warlords seeking career transitions. Jake grinned. Now you're thinking like a manager. Outside the conference room windows, the stars looked exactly the same as they had 6 months ago. But somehow the galaxy felt like a friendlier place. A place where problems could be solved with conversation instead of conquest, where differences could be settled over coffee instead of through combat. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And sometimes, Jake reflected, better was good enough to build on. Besides, he still had Sundays off.